The fall of 2024 was supposed to be just another semester. I had spent years studying and teaching the history of Christianity, believing I had a firm grasp on its origins. But nothing could have prepared me for what was about to happen. Because on October 20th, 2024, I died. And in those moments, I learned a truth so profound, so shattering, that I can never see the church the same way again. A normal day. Until it wasn't. It started as just another morning. I was driving to campus, running through my lecture notes in my head, thinking about how I would explain the role of early Christian leaders. And then, in an instant, everything changed. A semi-truck lost control on the slick highway. There was the screech of metal, the sickening jolt, my car spinning into darkness, and then silence. Peace. The most profound peace I had ever known. I was clinically dead for exactly 7 minutes and 23 seconds. But what I experienced in that time, what I saw, what I learned, felt like an eternity. Every second of it is burned into my soul, clearer than any memory I've ever had. The moment everything changed, I expected a tunnel of light, maybe a feeling of floating. But that's not what happened. Reality itself unraveled. It was as if the world I had always known was just a thin veil, peeling away to reveal something infinitely more real underneath. It was like waking up from a dream, but the dream was my entire life. And then, he was there. Not the distant, untouchable Jesus of paintings and stained glass. He was more a foundation. Built on faith, not hierarchy. I had always believed that Peter was the singular rock upon which the church was built. That's what I had been taught. But what Jesus showed me turned everything I knew upside down. "Look closer," he said. And as I watched, I understood. The rock wasn't about creating a supreme leader. It was about faith. Peter's testimony was one of many foundations upon which the early believers built their community. It wasn't about power. It was about shared strength. And that was just the first of many revelations that shattered my understanding of the early church. A church unlike anything we've been told. The scene shifted again, and suddenly, Jesus and I were no longer in that small gathering in Jerusalem. We were standing in the streets of ancient Rome. The contrast was staggering. The scent of incense filled the air. Merchants shouted over the crowds and towering temples loomed over us. This was the center of the empire, the heart of power. Jesus turned to me. "Now," he said, "let me show you something that will challenge everything you've been taught about how my church became what it is today." And then, before my eyes, I witnessed one of the most shocking truths of all. The real story of Constantine's conversion. The truth about Constantine's conversion. For years, I had been told the same story. A mighty emperor, visited by a divine vision, transforming into a devout Christian overnight. That's the version that made it into our textbooks. That's what I had taught my own students. But what Jesus showed me was far more complicated. Far more human. I saw Constantine in his private chambers, pacing, deep in thought. He wasn't basking in the glow of a miraculous revelation. He was calculating. "Watch closely," Jesus instructed. "What you're about to see has been misunderstood for centuries." Yes, the vision of the cross was there, but it wasn't just a spiritual awakening. It was a strategic decision. Constantine saw the growing influence of Christianity and realized its potential to unify his empire. Faith and politics were becoming intertwined in a way that would shape the church forever. "But isn't that wrong?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. We've always been taught that his conversion was purely miraculous. Jesus turned to me with a look of infinite patience. "My child," he said, "did you think I could not work through human ambition to achieve divine purposes? His words hit me like a thunderbolt. The establishment of Christianity as Rome's official religion wasn't just a spiritual victory. It was a carefully orchestrated political shift. And yet, through all of it, God's plan still unfolded. The council that changed everything. Then, Jesus took me to a moment that would shape Christianity for centuries, the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. I had always imagined it as a solemn, divine gathering where holy men, guided by the Spirit, peacefully formalized the doctrines of the faith. But that's not what I saw. Instead, the air was thick with tension. Bishops debated fiercely, their voices rising. Some argued passionately about the nature of Christ's divinity. Others clashed over the structure of church authority. Heated discussions erupted over which texts would be included in what we now call the Bible. It was not the serene, divinely dictated moment I had always envisioned. It was raw. It was human. And yet, through it all, the foundations of Christianity were being laid. Jesus must have seen the shock on my face because he turned to me with compassion. "Does it disturb you?" he asked. "To see such human elements in the formation of church doctrine?" I hesitated. "Yes," I admitted. "I always thought these decisions were made through pure, divine inspiration." Jesus smiled. "Ah," he said, "but isn't it more miraculous that I could work through human processes to preserve my essential truths? The miracle isn't that these men were perfect. It's that, despite their imperfections, my message of love and salvation endured. The teachings that were lost. And then, Jesus showed me something that made me gasp. We moved through different early Christian communities, groups that history had erased or branded as heretical. I saw the Gnostics, who believed in secret spiritual knowledge, the Ebionites, who still followed Jewish customs while honoring Jesus as the Messiah. Small house churches, each interpreting Christ's teachings in their own way. These were the voices that had been silenced, the beliefs that had been buried. And suddenly, I understood. The church we know today is only part of the story. What Jesus showed me next would be the most shocking revelation of all. Are you ready to see the truth? A question that changed everything. But which ones were right? I asked, my mind racing with the implications of what I had seen. Jesus turned to me, his gaze both patient and piercing. You're asking the wrong question. His words cut through my assumptions like a blade. What you're seeing, he continued, is how my followers, in their sincere desire to understand, interpreted my teachings through their own cultural and spiritual lenses. The truth was working its way through human understanding, like light through a prism. A chill ran through me as I grasped the weight of his words. It wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about the journey, how divine truth filtered through human minds, shaped by time, culture, and experience. And then, time shifted again. The rise of Rome, a matter of power and faith. I found myself standing in the heart of ancient Rome, its grand structures towering above us. The streets buzzed with life, filled with the sounds of merchants, soldiers, and priests. But Jesus didn't show me the Rome of emperors. He showed me the Rome of the early church. Watch, he said, as we observed the growing power of the bishops. See how they struggled to balance divine calling with earthly power. I saw the church's center shifting from Jerusalem to Rome, not just because of Peter's martyrdom, as I had always believed, but because Rome was the heart of the empire, the seat of influence and authority. I watched as early popes navigated both spiritual responsibility and political necessity. I saw how the church's structure evolved, borrowing from the very empire that had once persecuted it. Decisions weren't made in isolation. They were shaped by the realities of leadership, governance, and survival. But what about papal infallibility? I asked, struggling to reconcile what I was witnessing with what I had been taught. What about apostolic succession? Aren't those the foundations of church authority? Jesus' response was gentle, yet it shook me to my core. These doctrines developed over time as my followers sought to understand and organize my teachings. The authority is real, but it came through a process far more complex than most realize. The truth wasn't simple. It never had been. The lost and chosen gospels. Then, Jesus took me to a moment in history I had long studied but had never truly understood, the selection of the New Testament. I had always pictured it as a purely spiritual process, a group of holy men, divinely guided, carefully choosing the texts that best reflected God's will. That's not what I saw. Before me, I witnessed heated discussions, debates, and difficult decisions. Sincerity and scholarship were at play, but so were politics and practicality. See how they struggled? Jesus asked. They wanted to preserve truth. But the process was far more human than many today would like to believe. Some texts were included because they aligned with the growing church's doctrines. Others were left out, not necessarily because they were false, but because they didn't fit the evolving theological framework. I watched, both fascinated and unsettled, as doctrines and practices were shaped not just by divine inspiration, but by scholarly debate, cultural shifts, and even political necessity. Then Jesus turned to me, his eyes burning with a truth that made my soul tremble. The miracle of an imperfect church. This, he said, is perhaps the most important truth I want you to understand. I held my breath. The human elements in my church's development don't make it less divine. They make it more miraculous. Through political pressures, through cultural changes, through debates and even conflicts, my essential message of love and salvation has endured. I felt the weight of history pressing down on me. The faith I had known wasn't built in a single moment of divine clarity. It was shaped, refined, and even challenged by human hands over centuries. And yet, it had survived. Faith beyond illusions. As the vision continued, I saw the development of liturgies, the establishment of church calendars, the creation of feast days and fasting traditions. The practices we take for granted today were born from a fusion of spiritual inspiration and human adaptation. I turned to Jesus, my heart pounding. Why show me all this? I asked. Why reveal these complicated truths? His answer was both beautiful and challenging. Because it's time for my followers to understand that faith isn't about maintaining comfortable illusions. True faith can embrace both the divine and human aspects of my church's development. And with that, I knew this revelation wasn't meant to destroy faith. It was meant to deepen it. Would others be ready to see it? Jesus turned to me, his voice filled with unwavering certainty. The real miracle isn't that everything was perfect from the beginning. It's that, through all these very human processes, my truth and love have continued to transform lives. As we moved through these revelations, he showed me how the church faced crisis after crisis, times of division, corruption, and struggle. I watched as multiple figures claimed to be pope, as political power overshadowed spiritual authority, as the church seemed to drift away from its original mission. Jesus stood beside me, watching it all with neither anger nor despair. Instead, his eyes held something deeper, a quiet, eternal hope. Notice, he said during one particularly dark moment in history, how even in the worst of times, there were always those who held to my true message of love and salvation. The institutional church might struggle, but my real church, the community of faithful hearts, has never failed." His words sent chills through me. The real church wasn't a building. It wasn't an institution. It was the people, those who truly lived his message, no matter what happened around them. The worship that was lost. Then, Jesus took me somewhere unexpected, back to the earliest days of Christian worship. We stood inside a modest Roman home where a small group of believers gathered by lamplight. The air was thick with the scent of bread and wine. "Look carefully," Jesus said, gesturing to the scene before us. "See how different their worship was from what you know today." Tears welled in my eyes as I took in the simplicity and intimacy of it all. There were no grand cathedrals, no formal liturgies. These early Christians worshipped by sharing meals that nourished both body and soul. Their prayers weren't scripted recitations. They were raw, heartfelt cries of faith and gratitude. It felt so real, so personal, so unlike the structured services I had always known. But when did it change? I asked. How did we go from this to what we have now? The evolution of worship. Jesus then took me on a journey through time, and I watched as everything began to transform. The simple meals became more ritualized. Spontaneous prayers gave way to formal liturgies. House churches were gradually replaced by grand basilicas, their walls adorned with gold and marble. I could see why it happened. As the Christian community grew, they needed structure. When persecution ended, they could finally worship openly. Each change made sense in its time, but then Jesus said something that struck me to my core. Notice how each change served a purpose, but with every change, something was gained and something was lost. I felt an ache in my chest. What had been lost? The intimacy? The rawness? The deep personal connection? I had always thought of these changes as progress, but now I saw them for what they really were, a trade-off. Debating the divine. The revelations grew even more intense as Jesus showed me the formation of church doctrine. I saw the Council of Nicaea, where bishops argued over the nature of Christ. This wasn't the peaceful, holy gathering I had imagined. These were passionate, desperate debates, sincere believers struggling to define profound truths. "Watch their faces," Jesus said. "See the passion, the sincerity, but also the human limitations they wrestled with." I did, and what I saw shook me. Their decisions weren't made in a vacuum. Political pressures shaped their choices. Cultural contexts influenced their theology. Personal ambition sometimes played a role. And yet, somehow, through all this human messiness, divine truth still managed to shine through. The most shocking revelation. Jesus took a deep breath, and suddenly, we were standing in yet another pivotal moment in history. I was watching the church decide which texts would become scripture. I had always imagined this process as simple, a clear, divinely guided selection of holy writings. But what I saw was different. Church leaders debated. They discussed. They struggled over which texts to include and which to reject. Some writings were excluded not because they were false, but because they didn't fit the developing Orthodox framework. I watched as powerful, beautiful spiritual works were set aside, not because they lacked truth, but because they didn't align with the structure being built. Political and cultural forces played a role, even in these supposedly sacred decisions. I turned to Jesus, my heart pounding. Why? Why are you showing me this? His eyes met mine with an intensity that made my soul tremble. Because my followers need to understand, he said, that the human elements in my church's development don't make it less divine. They make it more miraculous. Through political struggles, through cultural shifts, through human flaws and ambitions, my truth has endured. That is the true miracle. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Everything I had believed was being reshaped. Faith wasn't about believing in a perfect church. It was about believing in a God who could work through imperfect people to reveal eternal truth. And for the first time in my life, I truly understood. A revelation of truth. Why were some texts chosen and others rejected? I asked. Jesus' gaze was steady, filled with both wisdom and compassion. The process was both divine and human, he explained. These leaders sincerely sought truth, but they were also products of their time and culture. They made decisions based on their best understanding, guided by my spirit, but limited by their human perspective. His words resonated deeply, but what came next nearly brought me to my knees. The evolution of papal authority. Jesus showed me how the concept of papal authority developed, not as a simple passing of power from Peter, but as a gradual evolution shaped by both spiritual needs and political realities. Watch carefully, he said, as I saw history unfold before me. See how the idea of papal supremacy grew over centuries, not days or years. I observed how the early bishops of Rome gradually gained influence, how shifting political landscapes helped solidify their authority, and how theological arguments were later constructed to support their growing power. The shock wasn't that papal authority wasn't real, but that its development was far more complex than the simple story we had been told. But what does this mean for church authority today? I asked, my voice trembling. Jesus' response was profound. Authority in my church has always been real, but its expression has always been shaped by human understanding and circumstances. The miracle isn't that it was perfect from the beginning, but that through all these human processes, my truth has continued to guide and transform lives. The forgotten role of women. As we moved through these revelations, Jesus showed me something that challenged my understanding even more: the role of women in the early church. I saw women serving as deacons, leading house churches, and playing vital roles in spreading Christianity. Their leadership was recognized, their contributions valued. But then, as the centuries passed, something changed. Their gradual exclusion from leadership wasn't a divine mandate. It was a human decision, shaped by cultural norms and societal expectations. Jesus' voice was gentle yet firm. This too is part of the story that needs to be understood. See how human customs and prejudices affected my church's development. It was clear, what had been presented as unchangeable truth was often just the result of historical and cultural shifts. The evolution of church practices. The revelations kept coming, each more shocking than the last. I saw how confession evolved from a public act of reconciliation to the private sacrament we know today. The understanding of the Eucharist developed gradually over centuries. Concepts like purgatory and indulgences emerged through a complex mix of theological reflection and cultural influences. Everything I had assumed was set in stone had actually changed and developed over time. Faith in the midst of change. I turned to Jesus, my heart heavy with questions. If all of this is true, what does it mean for faith today? Jesus' response was both challenging and comforting. The truth about my church's development doesn't weaken faith. It should strengthen it. Understanding how I work through human instruments, with all their limitations and complexities, shows the true miracle of my continued presence in the world. My breath caught in my throat. Faith wasn't about believing in a flawless institution. It was about believing in a God who works through imperfect people to reveal divine truth. The final message. As my time with Jesus drew to a close, he showed me one last vision. I saw the church through the ages, its triumphs and failures, its struggles and victories. The scene began to fade, and I felt myself being drawn back to my body. But before I left, Jesus spoke one final message to me. Share what you've seen, Christina. Tell them that understanding the human aspects of my church's development doesn't diminish its divine nature. It reveals the true miracle of how I work through human beings in all their complexity. I gasped awake in the hospital room, the truth of what I had witnessed burning in my soul. The doctors called my survival miraculous. But I knew the real miracle was something even greater. Understanding that God's work in the world isn't about maintaining comfortable illusions. It's about embracing the beautiful, complex reality of how He works through humanity. I share this testimony not to challenge faith, but to deepen it. The truth Jesus revealed to me shows that God's work in the world is more amazing than we've imagined, not because it is perfect, but because it is real. And that is the most important truth of all.